What's up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here, and I've got another video for you about ecology and ecosystems. In today's video, we're going to be focusing in on the biotic component of an ecosystem and looking at how different members of a biological community of organisms interact with one another inside of an ecosystem. Now remember, a community is all of the living things in an ecosystem, and a community is made up of lots of different populations of organisms. These populations do different jobs in an ecosystem, and we call these jobs a niche. So every group of organisms has a niche that they fill in an ecosystem, and some of those niches are more important than others, but they're all important to maintaining the stability of an ecosystem over time. So an example of an important relationship that's going to exist in pretty much any ecosystem is the relationship between a predator and its prey. Osprey depend on the presence of fish, cheetah depend on the presence of antelope, lynx depend on the presence of rabbits, and snakes depend on the presence of frogs. And without those prey species, those predators aren't going to be able to make their living in that environment. They aren't going to have things to eat. Conversely, those predators also help to keep in check the populations of their prey. So osprey are preventing the fish populations from getting too large. Cheetah are preventing the gazelle populations from getting too large. Lynx are preventing the rabbit populations from getting too large, and so forth. And by doing this, they're actually helping those prey populations to be stronger as a result, because very often predators are picking off the weaker members of a prey population. They're not going out and catching the strongest and fastest gazelles or antelopes. They're catching the weaker gazelles, the slower gazelles, the sick gazelles. And so by doing that, cheetahs are helping that gazelle population to stay healthier over time. Another example is the relationship between herbivores and the plants that they eat, or the plants that they depend on. Some of them have very, very specialized relationships with the plants that they eat. For example, the hummingbird in this picture can only visit certain kinds of flowers, flowers that have the right shape so that it can insert its beak and drink the nectar. If the flower doesn't have the right shape, that hummingbird isn't going to be able to visit it, and it's not going to be able to get any food. Our friend the panda bear only eats bamboo, so obviously the panda bear can't live in ecosystems where there aren't any bamboo plants growing. Some organisms get by pretty much eating whatever it is that they can find, and omnivores like the black bear are a good example of that. Black bears will eat animals if they can find or catch them. They will eat berries, and they'll eat human garbage if they get an opportunity as well. And because of this, we also call them generalists. They're not very specialized in what they eat. They pretty much eat whatever they can find. And in the case of bears eating human trash, sometimes that gets them into trouble. But it also makes them really flexible species in their environment because they're not limited to just one kind of plant or one type of prey that they can eat. They're really good at getting by in a variety of ecosystems because they have such a wide variety in their diet. Then there are the organisms that do sort of the uglier jobs in an environment, but these are really important jobs too. And we don't often pay too much attention to the organisms that are cleaning up the trash, but these organisms that we call scavengers and detritivores are doing a really important job in any ecosystem because they're doing a job that prevents basically the garbage from piling up. Scavengers and detritivores make their living in the ecosystem by eating dead plants and animals. And by eating these dead plants and animals, they're helping to break those things down and return their basic components to the soil so that plants can then absorb those nutrients and then pass those nutrients on to herbivores, who then pass those nutrients on to carnivores, and so forth up the food chain. Not all relationships in an ecosystem are based on one organism eating another organism. There are a lot of really important relationships that develop in an ecosystem based on competition between species. And this thing called the competitive exclusion principle states that no two groups of organisms can occupy the same niche in the same ecosystem at the same time. And remember, that niche is like their job. It's their way of getting by in their ecosystem. And if that niche is filled, then it's going to be difficult for another organism that has the same niche to get settled in that environment. And a good example, actually an example that can be conducted in a lab, is what we see happen when we try to grow two populations of paramecium together in the same petri dish. Now, if those two populations of Paramecium are grown separately in different petri dishes, as we see here in this first graph, then they both do pretty well, and you can see here that both populations grow pretty rapidly for a while, reach some maximum population density, and then their numbers kind of level out. However, when we try to grow both species of Paramecium together in the same petri dish, as we see down here, we can see a pretty good illustration of that competitive exclusion principle kicking in, because a petri dish is a pretty small ecosystem, really, and there really aren't any extra nutrients, extra space, any extra niches inside of that petri dish. So as these populations of Paramecium are growing and competing with one another for space and resources and things like that, one of them is eventually going to win out. And we can see here that the blue line represents the population that is a more successful competitor. And that line looks very much like it did in the graph where we saw the Paramecium populations growing in separate petri dishes. What happens to the other population, however, is that it tries and it struggles by for a time, but eventually it gets outcompeted and its numbers start to fall. It just can't get by in that ecosystem because there's another superior competitor already occupying that niche, and there's literally no space for a second Paramecium population to grow in this same environment. And we see a similar thing happen with barnacles. And if we look at these two species of barnacles, whose names, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to pronounce, so I'm just going to call them the brown species and the blue species. If we look at these two species of barnacles, we can see this thing called their fundamental niche labeled here on the drawing. And what that fundamental niche is the maximum possible space that they could occupy and could get by in that particular environment. So, for our brown species of barnacle, that's this whole area, and if it didn't have anybody else to compete with, that brown species of barnacle would occupy this entire niche, and that's why we call it its fundamental niche. It's the niche that it could occupy if conditions were ideal. As for the blue barnacle's fundamental niche is not quite as large, and we might infer from this that maybe the blue species of barnacle has a lower tolerance for drying out, which is why it has to stay closer to the water. We don't know that for sure, but that's a reasonable inference based on this data. And its fundamental niche overlaps with the fundamental niche of the brown barnacle. When living together in the same environment, we can see that they sort of sort themselves out, and the brown barnacle is going to live up here, the blue barnacle is going to live down here, and that's what we call their realized niche. That's the actual niche that they are occupying in this environment. And you might also infer from this data that the blue species of barnacle is a superior competitor, because under ideal conditions, the brown species of barnacle could be living across this entire niche. But it's not. Its range is effectively cut off right there, which suggests that the blue species of barnacle is a superior competitor, and it's causing the brown species of barnacle to get forced out of that space where the two could potentially overlap. And of course, it's not just animals that compete with one another in the ecosystem for resources. Plants compete with one another too. Plants are competing with one another for growing space, for sunlight, for water, for nutrients, and in ecosystems that have an awful lot of primary productivity, ecosystems like rainforests, as we see here in this picture, all of these plants are going to be furiously competing for a very, very limited amount of space and sunlight. And seeds that get dropped to the floor in this ecosystem may never grow into anything because sunlight is not going to make it down through the canopy into the forest floor. Should a tree fall down, however, that's going to open up some space, and that's going to allow some new plants to try to get their foot in the door, to try to make a go of it, and to try to compete with the other species there for that new sunlight that suddenly becomes available. Organisms that have a very close connection or relationship with one another are said to be in symbiosis with one another. For example, there are certain relationships in an ecosystem that are mutually beneficial. These organisms aren't feeding on one another and they're not competing with one another, but somehow they've found a way to help each other out so that it's beneficial for both organisms. And this kind of symbiosis that is mutually beneficial is called mutualism. And we've got some pictures on this slide that represent that kind of a relationship. For example, the relationship between pollinators and flowers is an example of mutualism. It's mutually beneficial for both organisms because the pollinators get a meal out of it. They're visiting the flower so that they can collect nectar. And then they also help the flower to reproduce so that it's beneficial for the flower as well. Down here in the bottom corner we see another example between a sea anemone and a fish called a clownfish. Sea anemones have stingers, so they're able to provide protection, and the clownfish doesn't get stung because it's going through and it's actually picking out parasites. So once again, the clownfish gets a meal out of this arrangement, the sea anemone gets cleaned from this arrangement, and the sea anemone also helps to protect the clownfish from other predators, since other predators are likely to get stung by the sea anemone if they come too close. So another example of a mutually beneficial relationship. Another example of a mutually beneficial relationship is the relationships that a lot of plants have with soil fungi. And in this picture here, we can see an example of that very relationship. And although it can be difficult to tell the difference between the roots of a plant and the filaments of a fungi in the soil, we can kind of delineate that because our plant's roots are quite a bit thicker. And off to the side, all of this area out here where we see the really thin filaments, all of that is actually not plant material, that's actually fungal material. And plants have a really important relationship with fungi in the soil because that fungi in the soil sort of extends the roots of the plants. It helps that plants to gather additional water from the soil. And the benefit for the fungi is that the plant is seeping some nutrients out into the soil. So the fungus gets a meal, the plant gets extra water, and both of these are able to benefit each other. And finally, one example that we have down here in the other corner of our drawing is an example of mutualism involving an organism called a lichen. And lichens are an interesting organism because although we refer to lichens as an organism, lichens are actually two organisms living together. The thing that makes a lichen green is algae, and that algae is able to photosynthesize and it provides the lichen with food. The other part of a lichen is a fungus, and that fungus is what makes the structure and what helps to make a home for that algae. So the algae and the fungus live together. The fungus provides the home and the structure. The algae provides the food, mutually beneficial to both parties. Another example of symbiosis is this relationship that we call commensalism. And it's kind of an interesting one because commensalism is really only beneficial for one organism involved, and the other organism doesn't really feel the effects of this relationship. So we've got some examples here on this slide of this kind of commensalism relationship. Here in this picture, it looks as though it might be just one tree, but it's actually a tree with a lot of other smaller plants growing on it. And all of these little things that we see, like here and up here and down here, these are all plants called bromeliads. They're actually in the same family of plants as pineapples. But these bromeliads have another name. They're also called epiphytes. And an epiphyte is a plant that basically grows on another plant, and it basically just lets its roots dangle out into the atmosphere, maybe sort of grows along the outside of that other plant, but they don't really grow in the soil like we think of a typical plant growing. So this is an example of commensalism because the bromeliads get a big benefit out of this relationship. They're able to grow higher up in the forest canopy and get a lot more sunlight as a result. They're able to make their living this way. However, the tree that they're growing on isn't affected one way or the other. It's not harmed by this relationship, it's not helped by this relationship, but it is a part of this relationship. Without the tree there, obviously the bromeliads would have nowhere to grow. We can see over here another example of commensalism. All of these birds that are following around the water buffaloes are following them around because when the water buffaloes are moving through the grass, they're stirring up a lot of insects. And these birds follow behind them, and they get a pretty easy meal out of it. So the water buffalo don't really get any benefit out of this particular relationship, but by following the water buffalo around, the birds are able to get a meal out of it. And that's a very similar example actually to what we see going on down here with the shark. And for some reason this shark doesn't have a taste for the fish that are following it around, but a lot of sharks have a small school or basically an entourage of fish that follows them around cleaning up their scraps. And the shark doesn't eat them for some reason. Maybe they don't taste good, maybe they're too bony, but whatever it is, these fish get a pretty easy meal by following the shark around, and the shark feels no real benefits of this relationship. So our last example of symbiosis is what we call parasitism. And there's probably some parasites that you're already familiar with, especially if you've ever been bitten by a mosquito or by a tick, which are both parasites that we have in the ecosystems where we live. And ticks and mosquitoes can also be dangerous because ticks and mosquitoes can also carry diseases, which they can transfer from one person to another. Mosquitoes, for example, around here can carry West Nile virus. In other parts of the world, mosquitoes carry malaria. Some ticks carry Lyme disease, which is particularly painful. Other examples of parasites, there's a lot of examples of parasitic worms, things like hookworms, and we can see an example of those hookworms over here. They get inside of people through contaminated drinking water, or if people are walking around and they have maybe an open sore on their foot, they can get in that way. But these parasites actually grow inside, and they can reproduce inside of a person, and they can make them sick as a result. So these parasites are taking advantage of another organism to help them reproduce and to feed and things like that. And they might slowly cause a degradation of health in the organism that they are parasitizing. Plants can be parasites as well, and over here we see a pretty good example. Somewhere deep down in the mess of all of this plant matter is an actual tree, and growing around the outside of the tree are all of these vines, and all of these vines belong to this plant called the strangler fig. And it's called the strangler fig for reasons that are probably pretty obvious. As this vine is growing up around this tree, it grows very, very rapidly, and it uses this tree as a means to get up into the sunlight so that it can photosynthesize. But because it grows so fast, it basically chokes out this tree entirely, and eventually this tree inside of the strangler fig is going to die, leaving a hollow cavity. There's a group of parasites out there that we call brood parasites, and they're not all members of the same species. There are fish that are brood parasites, and there are birds that are brood parasites, but we're going to do an example of a brood parasite that's a bird. And this brood parasite is the cuckoo. And what the cuckoo will do is it'll come along and it'll lay its egg in another bird's nest. And because the cuckoo develops a lot faster, that's going to be the first egg to hatch inside of this nest, and the cuckoo offspring is actually going to push the other eggs out of the nest. So those other eggs never even get to hatch because the cuckoo baby pushed them out. Now what's going to happen over time is that because the mother doesn't know any better, because that's the egg that hatched inside of her nest, the mother is going to continue feeding this cuckoo offspring, despite the fact that it's going to get huge, despite the fact that, as you can see here in this picture, the darn thing hardly even fits inside of the nest anymore. Here is our cuckoo, and down here at the bottom you can see the nest that it's attempting to sit in. And basically it's leeching off of this parent organism. This parent organism is feeding it, despite the fact that it's not its natural offspring, because it doesn't know any better. And then this cuckoo will grow up, it will lay its eggs in some other bird's nest, and it'll have that other bird take care of its offspring. So if you're an ecologist trying to study an ecosystem, that's going to be a pretty complicated task because there are so many moving parts in an ecosystem. You've got herbivores eating plants, you've got carnivores eating herbivores, you've got carnivores eating other carnivores, and you've got omnivores eating some of everything. You've got decomposers breaking down the waste and returning those bits to the soil. You've got animals parasitizing other animals. You've got animals in competition with one another. You've got plants in competition with one another. It's a lot to keep track of. But that's why scientists have developed these tools that we call models to help them study these complex systems. And an example of a model that we can use to study an ecosystem are these models that we call food webs. And what a food web does is it sort of helps us to sort out all of these different relationships inside of an ecosystem. It helps us to see pretty clearly all of the different feeding relationships in that ecosystem, and then by association we can also infer something about the competitive relationships in that ecosystem as well as some of the other more interesting relationships that we just talked about. And although all food webs are going to look a little bit different, there are some similar things to all of them that are worth knowing about. For example, the directions of all of these arrows, they show the direction that matter and energy are traveling in. So, when a deer eats a plant, matter is being transferred from the plant to the deer. So we draw our arrow from the plant to the deer. And then as that deer is consumed by a mountain lion, matter is going to be transferred from the deer to the mountain lion. So we draw our arrow in that direction as well. And as we can see here, there are a lot of different feeding relationships in any given environment, but this kind of model helps us to see them a little bit more clearly and helps us to make predictions about what might happen if, for example, the pika were going to be removed from this ecosystem. And if the pika were to be removed from this ecosystem, we might be able to make some predictions about how that's going to affect the organisms that depend on their relationship with the pika. Now, the thing that this particular food web doesn't show terribly well is the decomposers in our ecosystem and what they're doing here. And I've got a pretty good analogy for you. We've talked about how decomposers are the recyclers in our environment, but if we look at this picture here, we can see that we've got some machines. We've got a machine that represents our decomposer, and we've got a machine that represents our primary producers. And what our decomposer does is it's going to take this thing, in this case it's a little house made out of Legos, and it's going to break that thing down into its most basic parts. And then those most basic parts can be reassembled by primary producers and then put back into the food chain again. So one thing that we don't really see going on here is the fact that all of our organisms that we see here in our food web, when they die, all of their parts are going to be returned back here to the soil again. And it's the decomposers that are going to help with that. And then the plants are going to take those nutrients in out of the soil and pass them into the food chain again. Now, although our food web doesn't do a very good job of showing the role of decomposers in this particular ecosystem, one thing that this model does really well is show us the different trophic or feeding levels in this ecosystem. And not all food webs are going to be set up this way, but this one is set up so that each row is basically a different trophic level. We have our top predators, and then we have our sort of mid-level predators, and then we have our herbivores, or our primary consumers down here, and then at the very bottom of our food web, we have the producers. And they say decomposers, but there really aren't too many decomposers being depicted there. We can see then how these different levels are going to be interacting with one another and how each level depends on the level below it for its survival. Here we see what's called a kelp forest ecosystem. These are ecosystems that exist right off the coast of our country and other countries, and they're basically like the forests of the sea, if you will. These kelp grow really, really fast and really, really tall, and they're kind of like trees in the ocean. And they support a variety of life in those ecosystems. But we might ask ourselves, for example, what's going to happen to this ecosystem if we remove the sea otter? This scenario has actually played out before. And if we look at a kelp forest ecosystem where the sea otters have been removed, we see a much different kind of ecosystem. And you might notice that it's a lot less biodiverse, as a lot of these organisms have been grayed out because their numbers have declined so much that they hardly exist in this ecosystem anymore. So one thing we should notice is that without these sea otters here to keep their population under control, the population of sea urchins has gone kind of berserk. And when the population of sea urchins gets out of control like that, the sea urchins consume basically the entire kelp forest, and the entire kelp forest goes away. Because that kelp is food to a lot of other organisms, we can see here a lot of examples of relationships that don't exist anymore. And because the kelp aren't there, the kelp aren't able to support all of these other organisms. And in turn, organisms that depend on organisms that depend on kelp are affected by that as well. And this trickle-through effect is what we call a trophic cascade. The effect of the absence of just one organism ends up having a cascading effect through the entire ecosystem. And so as it turns out, sea otters are really, really important stabilizing forces in this ecosystem. Without the sea otter here, this ecosystem basically falls apart. And they play such an important role in this ecosystem that we've given them a name, and we call these kinds of species keystone species, because they're so important to that ecosystem that without them, the ecosystem falls apart. That's all for today's video. Remember, you can go back and watch this video as many times as you need to until you feel like you understand the concepts and the vocabulary, and make sure that you're asking questions if you have any. And with that, we'll see you next time.